welcome Kathy Davies. Thank
you
you
very
so
much.
much for being part of our inaugural online event and also for agreeing to be part of our conference, even though COVID stole you from us at the time.
I'm very honoured, thank you.
We would love to know how you got started studying buildings to begin with, which then led you to this wonderful source of information that we found so useful. Can you give us a bit of an insight?
Well, yeah. I've always liked old buildings, felt more affinity with them, but I was working in planning, which was okay, but I kept coming across old buildings. And so I did a master's in building conservation and got a job doing historic buildings in areas, which I love. And I've done that ever since for sort of over 30 years. And I was working in Shropshire, and which is stuffed full of really early buildings, which the 20th century left behind a bit. It was, motorways, there was none near there, everything was happening elsewhere. Nothing was happening in Shropshire, to the point that some of the buildings I went in that were so decayed, the stairs had gone and the people had never bothered going upstairs for 20 years or so. It was just extraordinary, the state of decay of some of the buildings. So going around some of these, I came across wall paintings and I thought, what's that about? And like a good building conservation officer, you have to understand the significance of what it is you're looking at before you make a decision about what should happen to it. And I couldn't find out anything about them. I tried the Royal Commission and they said, oh, we don't really know, they're probably late 16th century, we think. And so I decided to do some research on it. By chance, I was sat next to somebody at a conference and said, oh, I would love to do a doctorate on this, but, I work full time. And he said, oh, they've just started doing part-time doctorates at Oxford. Why don't you apply? Closing date's Monday. So I got my skates on and I was accepted to do, it was one of the first part-time doctorates at Oxford, because being Oxford, it thinks you need to do it full time to do it properly, whereas in fact, this sort of the scheme that I was on felt that work can inform your research and research inform your work, so that the result is more than the sum of the parts. And I think that was definitely the case with me. So I started looking for, whenever I go in an old house, I always look now, and know that if you look in the roof space or in the airing cupboard or, the bits that haven't been redecorated, you find evidence of wall paintings. So one of my theses was that all houses that were built in anything like a permanent construction in the late 16th century had wall paintings. And I think they did, and I think even before that, people would stick, broadside sheets on ballads and things. So the sort of Elizabethan love of decoration, was right down the social scale.
That's so wonderful, isn't it? Such a wonderful image, because certainly when we look at all of our documentary sources, the wills and inventories to draw out details of dress, we quite often come across references to very colourful interiors, the painted wall hangings and textile decorations that were coloured. And so I guess wall paintings don't often feature because they don't have an inherent value. But how do you find that the people that now own these properties, are they generally appreciative of them or scared of the responsibility of having them? Or how do you find them?
I'll answer that in a sec. Just to go back to why they don't feature in wills and inventories, they're not movable goods. So I've gone through loads and loads, and very occasionally you find reference to a painted room. Painted cloths, there are lots, and they died out in the first quarter of the 16th century. But anyway, so mixed reaction. Some, it's an absolute pain. What are they going to do with this scabby wall painting on the wall? And I have gone back to find that it had fallen off the wall and been offered it in a box, and there are one or two who are not pleased by having them. And the answer then is just say, fine, you can cover it over as long as it's done properly. and we can have access to it, though not always, you can't always have access. Sometimes they just record it and cover it over again. But others are really keen and want to learn about it, and open their house for people to come and have a look at. The sort of consolidation of them isn't particularly expensive, but sometimes to make them look presentable, if you wanted to have it as a wall in your room, the convention is to make good the painting, but in a way so that you can see that it's been made good, it's not primary. And those are the best ones in a way, but it's quite expensive, that. So, but I would say most people, some are indifferent, some definitely don't like it, but most have sort of got some pride in the fact that they've got a really, really interesting bit of history there.
Can you give us some idea of how you went about your research for your PhD? You obviously had a good working knowledge of what you might be studying, but it's interesting that you focused on the marches of Wales. Do you think, was that a convenient sample for you, or did you focus on that for a particular reason?
No, it's just I was working in Shropshire and knew building conservation colleagues along the marches, and then I looked at what the marches actually were. There were 6 counties covered by the Marches administration in the early modern period, so I thought I ought to include all those counties. But then I've had criticism for not going further east and not going further west and missing out further bits of Wales. So when there's been sort of interesting wall paintings, certainly in Wales, because there haven't been that many, I've included those in the second edition. And the same, I've included more of Cheshire, because there's a particular group of houses in Cheshire that are interesting. But I had to stop looking. There were just so many. I had to stop looking, because if you come across a house from the late 16th century that's got original fabric, it will have wall painting on it.
Well, that's quite exciting, isn't it?
Yeah,
if also daunting, it could definitely be a lifetime's work, couldn't it?
Yes, I've got lots and lots and lots that I still haven't written up in other parts of the country. You find them in areas that were the concept of the Great Rebuilding, which was the sort of second half of the 16th century, when people started to improve their housing conditions. There was improvements in glass technology and enclosing hearths. Because if you think about it, the old medieval houses had a hearth in the middle of the floor, so that the smoke would go out through a hole in the roof, a louver in the roof. And glass was very, very expensive, so you quite often just had a shutter or a piece of horn or something in a window, so you couldn't see the inside very well. So there was no point having a nice decoration if you couldn't see it. So once there were improvements in glass technology, and hearths were enclosed, people could decorate their house and see it, see it much more easily. So areas of the country that had that sort of housing improvements during the 16th century tend to have wall paintings. Areas like the Pennines and the Welsh Hills, they were still living in not very good housing. That housing technology had not improved particularly, so you don't find them there. They didn't remodel their houses till after wall paintings had gone out of fashion, and they dropped out of fashion like a stone in the sort of probably the second quarter of the 17th century. Changed completely.
I think for our purposes, it's very helpful that you focused on the marches and can put it into context in terms of how housing stock was improving there during that particular period. Because for us, the fact that this is far away from London makes it much more arguable as evidence for ordinary people's dress. Because there's always this idea that the representation of dress tends to focus on the elite, and your book makes a very clear case for these clothes being represented as ordinary or best dressed for people who are far from London, and that's very useful for our purposes, I think.
There was a sort of slight increase in activity, if you like, or connection to London, because the Council of the Marches it was based in Ludlow, but it moved up to Shrewsbury. And so it did sort of move about the border a bit, and you did find there was some sort of courtiers attached to it, but it was limited. I would say it's limited, yeah. And I'm absolutely convinced these are, what we're seeing is ordinary dress. One of the things that I concluded from my research was that I didn't always know what these wall paintings were telling us, but I did know they contained a huge amount of information on everyday life, people's values, the early modern values that there was no way of accessing any other way, because these are people who didn't write, they didn't leave journals, they don't feature in court circulars and lots of things. We just know the only information we've got about them is births, marriages and deaths, and then what's in their houses. So I just knew there was a huge amount of information there. And when you contacted me to say, well, this is really useful for costume, I thought, well, yeah, obviously it is, yeah.
And obviously for our purposes, we've asked you to focus on the paintings that are figurative. How common is it to find figurative paintings, and what are the other types that you see?
There's not that many figurative ones, actually. There's a lot are just sort of purely decorative. They could be very simple, like decorating joists or something. You can do a simple S-line or a guilloche, and you can make, or a zigzag. You can do some patterns quite bold in sort of bright colours that have a fantastic impact, but are very cheap and cheerful, quick to do. You get floral motifs, usually set within a framework. And interestingly, some of those frameworks are taken from textile patterns, imported textiles, this sort of Mooresque design, strapwork designs. So you get, a strapwork with a sort of floral motif in the middle. You get a lot of antique work or grotesque work, the Italian Renaissance stuff, which is, to do well, is difficult, time consuming and requires skill, but skill was not necessarily what people were after, a skilled, an accomplished wall painting. So you get some terribly crude antique work ones, badly set out, badly depicted, but it didn't matter. It was the overall effect that people were after. So, and some heraldic devices, which are sort of obviously illustrating displaying status was a big deal. People were trying to up their status, and that was done by improving your standing with your neighbours, if you could sort of prove you were sort of one up on them. So it was anything that would increase their standing.
I think one of the most interesting parts of your book is where you talk about the people who would have been doing the paintings. So do you think you could share a bit of information about what was the range of people who were doing the work in these houses in order to up the status of the owners?
Well, it, for the most part, wasn't artists, that's for certain, or even dedicated painters. I looked through wills and inventories for 200 years worth in the Marches to look for painters, and I found very few. Someone subsequently has found a lot more, and I've looked at those, and they're mainly doing heraldic work for, hatchments or family trees, where they have all the heraldic devices showing each family. So painters were doing that sort of work, and for the most part it was just building craftsmen. Anybody who'd got any sort of hand and eye coordination, I think, could do it. There were simple ways of setting out, with a snap line, a string pulled tight with some pigment on it, sort of carbon or ochre or something, snapped against a wall. You get a nice straight line. You could get a framework, and then I've found sort of needlework patterns. Actually, a lot were copied from needlework patterns, So it was plasterers, carpenters, any sort of woodworker, glassmakers, gardeners, any sort of building craftsman really could do this. But there is a book called The Schoolhouse for the Needle, some of you may know it, and it's got a little grid at the back, and you would prick out, you'd sort of copy a design on the grid, I think you could trace it, and then you'd prick that out and you'd get your design onto your fabric. If you blow that up and do your grid size of a wall, you can reproduce the pattern that way. So I've got there was a reproduction of that. I've got a copy of that, which actually, and I've actually got a wall painting that's taken from a design from that.
We sell that very book.
Oh, do you?
Our Etsy shop.
Sure, I
If anyone would be interested in adorning their house with a wall painting of their own making, I think Nina's going to fetch a copy to show you all.
Yes, I am in the Etsy shop.
Yeah,
that's the one. Yeah, that's
Yep.
it. Yeah. So on the back, has your copy got that? No, on the inside, at the back, is that little graph?
Oh, the little grid, yeah.
And has that got a pricked out pattern?
Yeah.
oh, yeah.
Oh no, yours hasn't. Mine must be a different version then, because mine.
Oh no, it has got a print. It's got a little pricked out flower.
Yes, if you raise it a bit, if you raise yours, I can't see. Oh yes, there, right, yeah, yeah.
Yeah, in fact, we were lucky enough to have Elizabeth Mason, who got the facsimile of this book produced, because her husband bought the original for her as a gift. She brought us the original to see in the studio.
Oh, right.
It was amazing to see the actual pricked holes through an awful lot of the patterns. It was such an immediate connection with the fact that people had used this lovely resource for who knows what projects. Of course, it didn't stop and think that it might have been for a wall painting rather than textile work. And I love the idea that carpenters and plasterers and builders are doing this, because most of the plasterers and carpenters and builders I've met, to imagine them painting, needlework designs on the wall.
Well,
I might just ask them, would you mind?
Well, they could, if you gave them some direction. But when in the wills and inventories that I did go through, I say I didn't find many. I did find one painter near Oxford, actually, who was very poor. He didn't have much money, but he had lots of patterns belonging to the painter's trade. And I think these would have been sheets of vellum or something with a pricked out pattern, and he could just reproduce that.
Like effectively a bit like stencils.
Yes.
Yeah.
So stenciling was strictly prohibited, not that it stopped it, because it was what was it, false and encouraging idleness, things like that. So
was it regarded as counterfeiting if you
Yes.
stenciled rather than did it yourself?
Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Didn't stop people doing it, but there was a decree saying you shouldn't.
And what date was that decree?
I think that was actually 1605.
Oh, it's very interesting to think that that sort of thing was still being legislated against by that date. So if you were thinking of pimping your house, you had to consider what the statutes permitted you to do.
Well, it's like sumptuary laws, isn't it? People wore anything. Who's going to check on it,
There's a couple of interesting comments in the chat. Vida says, in the painting we're doing at Sigestown Castle in Wexford, Ireland, one of the great resources for design has been period needlework designs. And then Chrissy Carney says, German 16th century pattern books were often labelled for the craft trades, woodworkers and builders included.
Yeah.
That's nice to know. Because
Yeah.
I was wondering how particular to Britain this kind of taste for interior design was, or whether it appears on the continent as well.
Yeah, it does. It does. It's slightly different because I think it carried on there, and it changed in the, I say, the second quarter. The sort of plain wash and panelling became, with a sort of more Puritan influence, that it changed completely. And, you know, the rest of Europe didn't sort of quite have that, or certainly not in France and Italy. So I've not got to the bottom of that, actually, what happened there. But it carried on longer.
So as a final question then, before we look at your presentation, are you able to share with us what your most recent exciting discovery has been in wall paintings?
I think the one that it's not that recent, but it's not ever been published, at the Forge at Much Haddon in Hertfordshire, which is an extraordinary one. The building is extraordinary because it's quite humble, and it's in a room, in a wing, with direct access to the wing from outside, which is unusual. And in it is, in one room, a figurative scheme of the Judgment of Solomon. And Solomon looks like it's Elizabeth, and some of the bystanders look like Lord and Lady Kitson, and it's a great costume. I might have included it. I don't know whether I have actually.
Yeah.
Have I included it?
Yeah.
Oh,
Yeah,
right, that one, right. Oh, well,
And actually, I think what's lovely about the fact that you've highlighted it now and it is included in the presentation is that they're so beautiful, and no one will be denied access to see them. It's actually in a publicly
Yes, that's
accessible
right,
place,
yeah.
isn't it? Which is
Yeah.
great. So everyone can go and visit if they haven't already.
I'm also amazed to hear it hasn't been published, because I think this is a stupendous thing to be providing some scholarly insight into.
I think I wrote something on it in a chapter in a book, so I have done that, but I will. Hertfordshire's particularly rich, as you know, in wall paintings, apart from the Prodigal Son one. Yes, and there's another one in a pub in, where is it? Not far away in Hertfordshire, with figurative paintings all around the room again. And I think that does need writing up. So when I've finished.
Excellent. Well, it looks like it's time for us to hear your presentation. So I'm going to share my screen, and we can hear what you have to share with us about wall paintings, specific examples, although this is, I hasten to say, only a fraction of the information you have in your head, let alone in your book. So I need
apologies for the sound being a little bit, I was still feeling, I was knocked for six by COVID, and I was still not feeling robust afterwards, but there you go.
And can I get a few thumbs up from people that you're able to see the screen when I start? I'm getting a few thumbs up. So here we go.
Yeah, can see it.
This presentation will look at the evidence contained in wall paintings in the late 16th and early 17th century for contemporary costume at the vernacular level. There's plenty of evidence of Tudor dress in courtier portraits, but what were ordinary people wearing? Now, there's a very specific type of wall painting typically found in the late 16th and early 17th century. This was a period of transition in housing between the medieval house and the Renaissance house, which corresponds to a change from the feudal society with little social mobility to one where the opportunity for social advancement was considerable, and it brought considerable rewards. Status was a key to this, and it could be expressed in many ways. And one of them was display through wall painting. Now, there are many types of wall painting, but the ones I'm going to talk about now are figurative schemes, and in particular, figures in contemporary dress. And there are many examples of these. Now, some of the figures are depicted in their best dress, and others are in everyday or working attire. So there are lots of examples, and I'm going to deal with these in chronological order. Here, in an upper chamber at Olthry Hall in North Wales, is a portrait of Richard Ellis and his wife Jane. It dates to the 1550s, because Richard Ellis died in 50-55, so it was painted before he died. It'd be interesting to think, first of all, who would see this painting? It's in a chamber, but it's quite a private room, and it's likely to have been a bedchamber, but it may also have been used for receiving guests away from the more public hall. So there was some sort of display that Richard wanted to make to the guests who would see this. If we look closely at Jane's dress, we can see that she's actually holding a pair of gloves in her hand. Now, gloves were a sign of gentry status, because anybody who worked with their hands wouldn't be wearing gloves. So this is displaying their gentry status. And also in her other hand, Jane is holding a crocus, which could be a symbol of fertility. Richard Ellis and Jane had 9 sons and 4 daughters, and being painted towards the end of his life, this portrait could be his way of displaying his achievements in perpetuating the ancient lineage of the Ellis family. This painting, I think, may date from the mid-1560s. It's in an upper chamber in a small house in Guildford, and is showing a man parading in front of the town walls, and there's a moralising text in the frieze above. I think the clues to dating might be in the cross gaiters and also the basket handle sword. Looking more closely, we can see he's got a feathered hat, and he's got lots of detailing on his dress, including quite a small ruff, and then of course the detail of his sword. Here we've got a really complex scheme in a house, a small house in Much Haddon in Hertfordshire, and it's showing the Judgment of Solomon, and I think it was painted in about 1578. It's in a house owned by Clement Newes, who was local gentry, and it coincides with the time when Elizabeth was making a progress, Elizabeth I, that is, was making a progress through East Anglia. And the question is, the figure of Solomon doesn't look like a man at all. It looks as though it's a woman, and it could be the Queen, and it could be that she's being portrayed here as Solomon to flatter her in that she is having to make some very wise judgments on this tricky progress through East Anglia. She stayed at Hengrave Hall just before she came to Haddon, which is the home of the Kitsons, and it's possible that the figures on the right are Lord and Lady Kitson. And here is the detail of Solomon. It doesn't look very much like a man. And here is a close-up of the figures, which may or may not be the Kitsons. Whatever, they appear to be in best dress, and he's holding a feathered hat. At a house in Shropshire called Newhall at Ticklerton, we find a portrait of George Jenks and his wife in the 1580s, when this was painted just after he inherited the house via his marriage, and was also granted armigerous status. That was in 1584. Now, it's interesting here because they are both clearly wearing their best dress, and I think displaying their newly acquired gentry status, for his wife is playing a lute, which is obviously a gentry pursuit. But also, as he had fairly recently been married, I think it could also be illustrating his wife possibly being pregnant. If you look closely, you can see that her breasts are expressed, which is not normal in figure paintings. And also the female behind her holding a gillyflower over her, which is a symbol of fertility. It could be that the figure behind is his wife before she got married, But in any event, they're clearly displaying their status and possibly celebrating their marriage and the impending birth of an heir. Around the same time, we get this picture of Jane Andrew from Colnap Farm in South Wales. She got married in 1584 and she's holding out a bunch of gillyflowers. Now, this painting isn't in a focal point in a room. It's actually quite a small painting at the foot of a spiral stair leading up to a bedchamber. So I think she's not necessarily in best dress. She's probably in everyday dress. Moving across the country again, here we are in Hertfordshire, and we've got an amazing painting depicting the story of the prodigal son. And there's some fantastic detailing on this painting. Here we can see the prodigal son wining and dining and generally having a good time, surrounded by his mates in contemporary dress. We've got a serving girl carrying some food out to them. Here we've got presumably the landlady in a sort of more elaborate dress, but holding a tab of how much money they owe her. We've also got details of lots of other costumes, including these males who are greeting the prodigal son on his return. Now, these are all not necessarily in their best dress. They're in sort of everyday dress. They're not being shown for display. In Bewdley, in Worcestershire, in a small house overlooking the river on the first floor, is quite a complicated scheme depicting scenes from a vineyard. And you can just see a man in the bottom left-hand corner holding a pruning knife. And here's a detail of the man pruning. Now, there's quite a complicated backstory to what's going on here, but just focusing on the dress, I think this is not intended for display. This man is wearing his working clothes. This is one of my favourite wall paintings, actually. It's in Stowe Hall, in an extraordinary building, actually. It's in the room over the gatehouse, which is separate from the rest of the house. And I think it shows, it's almost like a cartoon. It is showing people in everyday dress. It's actually possibly a bachelor apartment, as it was called, where the men of the house would use and get up to no good. And it's completely separate from the rest of the house. But here, painted over the fireplace, is the ages of man. So reading from the left, it says, "Thus do I all the day. Thus do I while I may. Thus did I when I might. Good Lord, will this world last forever?" And I think it's clearly just meant for entertainment and certainly depicting people in everyday dress. So that was a quick romp through some of the figurative paintings that I've found. But I've got a few more, which I'm including to answer potential questions, questions which I raised myself and have answered over time as I got more evidence. And the first one is the evidence for dating. And here at Pittleworth Manor, this very helpfully has got dates on it. Here we've got the Royal Arms and very conveniently the date 1580, and above in the frieze you can also just make out the date 1580. This painting is showing the story of Davies and Lazarus, and we've got images of people in their best dress and with tables laden with food, and the poor man at the gate who's starving. But you can see some of the detail of highly elaborate dress here. And here in the male costume, quite badly done, slightly cartoonish, but the detail of the costume is interesting. Slightly later, into the 1590s, we get this portrait of a man and his wife in Dowles Manor in Worcestershire, which is now sadly demolished. It's interesting because it's showing the man and his wife in a companionable pose. It's not him dominating her, which you often get in courtier portraits. It's, I think, signifying a well-run household, and they are clearly in their best dress. They're not performing any tasks, so I think it is intended for display. I'm going to finish with the splendid costumes at Gilling Castle in the Great Chamber there. This was very lavishly decorated in the late 1580s. The walls, panelling and stained glass all date from this period. We have sort of moved out of the vernacular zone, but these costumes are beautifully depicted and the paintings so well preserved that it is worth showing you them all. They're all people clearly in their best dress and holding musical instruments. They're seated in front of a trellis covered in flowers and fruit. And all illustrating the gentry pursuit of playing instruments, sitting around in their best dress. So thank you for listening. And if you've got any questions or any queries, I'd be very pleased if you could email me and I will endeavour to answer them. Thank you.
Thanks very much.
Thank you. I can, of course, answer any questions now instead of you emailing them.
Yep, so we have a couple
Even
of
better,
questions.
isn't it? Sorry, Jodie, go ahead.
So Liz Jones has said there's loads of figurative designs and wall paintings in Wrocław in Poland, which is a reference to earlier when we were chatting.
Right.
Make a note of that.
Interesting.
Victoria, do you want to unmute yourself and ask your question?
Yes, I just wondered, and by the time I'd got it written down, I'd forgotten the name that you gave, but that's that girl holding the bunch of gilded flowers, and you gave her name, and I just wondered, you know, is there a caption giving it, or or is it a presumption from who you know the house belonged to at the time?
Yeah, I did do a lot of research into records, documentary records of who lived in the houses, and I didn't often find out, but the ones that I did find out who lived there, I could then find out quite a bit of history about them, which helped me to sort of assess their status. So this was, I think I've answered, it was owned by somebody called Alexander Grant. He was a farmer, but quite a well-to-do one, and he married Jane in 1582, and they lived in this house. We know they moved away, and then she came back in the early 1600s and died there in 1610. So there's quite a lot of documentary stuff on her.
Mm-hmm.
But sometimes I don't know who they are,
Thank you.
Noel was very excited about cone ruffs being on everyone. Do you have more to say on cone ruffs?
I don't know what a cone ruff is.
You will.
I think Noel is muted at the moment.
So someone can tell me.
No.
You unmute yourself.
Oh, we've lost it. Should we mute?
There I am.
Oh, there.
Super excited about the cone ruffs, because I don't know if this is any help to you, Catherine, but they have a very definite time signature beginning point. And you probably, do you know the date of the cone ruff-orama? What is the date on that particular thing? It's incredible. Just incredible that you found that.
we're going to come to that in a bit more detail in
Okay,
our
later.
presentation. But can you, for Kathy and anyone else's benefit, could you just describe what a cone ruff is?
Oh, okay.
Because there might be people who would be, you know, we're all terminology freaks here, aren't we? So it'd be great if you could maybe describe that.
Okay, and it's a neologism, or we don't really know what they were called because I've never read any description of them. So we started when we first noticed them, calling them O ruffs or cone ruffs. And unlike a figure of 8 ruff, which is it's a long line of fabric which describes figures of 8s like candy ribbons. What an O ruff looks like is basically just a circle, and it's a truncated cone which goes from the exterior circle back to the neck. And we couldn't really figure out how they were made. And it's wonderful because the earliest I've ever found is 1584, and then they kind of drop out of fashion around 1595. They're definitely very closely allied to Elizabeth. Even her gisant, her tomb cover, she's wearing one, even though it was out of fashion by the time she died. It's such a signature look for her. And so they're this very particular style of ruff that the exterior edge is just describes an O. And so we just made up the word cone ruff or O ruff for them. And when you see one, another thing odd about them is that they are specifically gendered female. I think I've only found one example, or had only found one example in a elite portrait. But then when I saw the picture of that you found in Hertfordshire, the men are all wearing them. So I'm just really super curious about that, but we'll talk about it. Just amazing, amazing. I don't have one handy, or I'd show you what it looks like.
No, I know the ones you mean now. Yeah.
I have a question though. The style, I don't know if you're going to go into this later. Were they working al secco on the paintings, or were they done al fresco? I mean, were they done on wet plaster or dry plaster?
All secco, no frescoes at all.
Okay. All right. All right.
Liz, did you want to come in? Unmute and come in with your question.
Oh, sorry. Thanks. Well, I was just a comment online about Crathie's Castle, because they near Aberdeen, right? They have a ton of ceiling paintings, I guess, and I was just interested in any commentary on those. They seem to be sort of contemporary to the ones you're talking about.
Yeah. I think there's a really interesting tradition in Scotland, and there's quite a good book published on decorative painting in Scotland, and they are a similar date. I've got a feeling that they've got more affinity with France because of the sort of cultural connections with France, and that's one thing is on my list to explore. But there's some really, really interesting ones, and Michael Bath has done research on that and traced the sources of the design, which is very specifically selected. So that they're a bit more refined, I think, than those that I've shown you, but they are dead interesting. Thank you.
Do you have the name of that particular book that you mentioned, the decorative painting?
It is. So it's Renaissance Decorative Painting in Scotland by Michael Bath.
Okay, thank you very much. I'll make a note of that.
Ellen, did you want to come in? You've got a comment about frescoes.
Oh, no, sorry. I was just saying that I haven't published yet, but I've been doing a lot of research on wall paintings for years. And one of these days I will. And I've been going, yes, Catherine, I have your book. But yeah, in England, unless I'm wrong, really the only frescoes for wall paintings are the ones in the Lewis group down in Sussex, in the UK. Even though generally they'll be described, even by some of the churches or things that they're in, they'll be described as frescoes, but they're not. seccos. I think only really the real frescoes are down in the Lewis group paintings, I'm pretty sure.
Yeah, no, I agree that there's no evidence of frescoes. They were in fact overpainted quite regularly.
Oh yeah.
So, you know, they just, once they got dirty, just a coat of lime wash and then another coat, another pattern design on top.
I think that's it for questions. So
yeah, I see that Victoria's commented, not sure how many vicars know that fresco isn't just a synonym for mural. That's probably true.
Yes, that is true, yeah.
I was wondering, those amazing pictures you showed at the end from Gilling Castle, Jane and I noticed that that property is up for sale, and heard a rumour that's possibly being turned into apartments. Do you know anything about that and what the potential fate of the paintings might be?
Well, it's owned by Ampleforth School, and it had a few unfortunate headlines which affected the school. You know, this sort of abuse of boys, basically, and they've always been very helpful to me when I've wanted to go, but it's been empty for quite a while now. They've sort of been maintaining it, but there's been no use for a number of years since the junior school, I think it was in there, it's closed down. They're very aware of the value of the decoration in that room. The panelling, it was actually stripped out once and on its way to America, and I think it was rescued and brought back. So it's, I mean, it's got extraordinary panelling, the painted panelling all round, and marquetry panelling, and then there's the glass in the windows. It is one of the most highly decorated rooms from the 1580s in the country. So that would be a great shame if it goes into private ownership.
I went to East Gilling just before Christmas, and when you see the building from the outside, you have absolutely no clue that it has this 16th century interior. It looks almost entirely 18th century. So when I heard from people in the pub in the village that it was possibly going to be turned into apartments, it didn't seem like a terrible disaster for what is quite a spectacular historical building on the top of a hill. But when you find out that this amazing treasure lives inside it, it's quite a surprise. Oh, it looks like we've got some more hands up.
we have, yeah.
Rebecca, would you like to say or ask your question?
Yes, thank you. I guess I'm curious if you have ever tried to correspond any of the garments depicted with wills to kind of be like, is this an actual garment that this person owned, or is this just wishful thinking? Like, it'd be like just thinking about them displaying themselves in best dress possible. Yeah, just how true to real life that could be.
No, that's an interesting idea to think whether you could, but no, I haven't. I've not actually matched up many wills to specific paintings. I can't think of any that have been that relevant, that have actually, because I've looked at probate inventories more, which doesn't mention clothes particularly, whereas wills, you know, leaving red dress to so-and-so. No, that's interesting, but no, I haven't done that.
Yeah, I guess then is your sense though that that would be the case, that this is like a realistic portrayal of what these people probably were wearing, or
whether that's their actual clothes? I assume that it is, but that's just an assumption. And I have got interestingly, I've got a slide in. I've got a few more slides just to sort of back up some evidence, which shows a possible source of information on the design. Yep, we'll show in a minute.
You're on mute, Jane.
Sorry, I was coughing.
Hey, did you want to ask your question?
Hi, I'm interested in I don't know if you can say a few words about color, because I've been noticing that some of it is monochromatic, which is kind of obvious. Just the drawing is really, it's very nice, makes it clear. I also noticed that the colors are limited in a number of the paintings you just showed, and then at the end, that last group was very rich and very colorful. And I wonder whether that what you just might want to have to say about that, and whether you think that that is accurate as far as the clothing, like the depiction, whether that whether we should interpret that as limited. The limit, we know, of course we know there were limited dyes available, but what would you say was the connection? I mean, I'm working on some wall painting, 16th century wall painting, and using a lot of color. So I'm just curious about the variety there.
I think people who were painting them had what I call a vernacular palette of pigments. And this is because the Painter Stainers Guild were always complaining about people pinching their work. It was decreed that, okay, you know, we can let woodworkers, carpenters, plasterers, all the rest of it paint, but they're restricted to whiting, blacking, red ochre, yellow ochre, red lead, and then rosette. All 5 of those are quite dull colours. Rosette was that fantastic flame coloured orange, but it was very fugitive, and there are records of people being taken to court for this false colour. So they paid for this brilliant flame colour, and it within a few weeks faded. But people liked it because it was so rich. So a lot of the paintings are done in those colours. Most of them are you know, mineral pigments, and so they're stable, they're not fugitive. I think a lot of wall paintings brightened up, added bits of more expensive pigments, and also I think they did possibly use bits of stuff left over from dyers. You know, you didn't need a lot of pigment, you only need a bit for a wall. You don't need like a whole vat full, which you do for dyeing cloth. But as I say, you find paintings with faded bits, and I think those are the organic pigments that from dyers. So whether they could depict the clothing well in those colours, I don't know. You can get quite a good range from those. Indigo was used a lot as well, so that and yellow ochre, you get a sort of, you know, a range of greens and bluey greens and things, some bright ones. But it's an interesting point whether they could actually depict the true colours of their costume. Don't know.
So do you think that the later ones that are very, very colorful, how do you think that happened? That that artist somehow had access to more colors and mineral paints? Or?
Yes, I think so. I think it might have been a dedicated painter. It might have been an artist doing that. Those at Gilling Castle that I showed, that might not have been a building craftsman. You know, I think we're definitely out of the vernacular sphere. We're in a sort of very upmarket, we're high status building there, and they could well have used more expensive pigments, mineral pigments that were outside the sort of, not only the remit of a building craftsman, but outside the purse of most people. You know,
so it would have definitely been an indicator of wealth to be able to have all of that color Absolutely. In your paintings.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Because they were only ever intended for the most part to be temporary. They were painted over because the rooms got so filthy dirty with smoke and soot. The fact that it faded. You know, there were organic pigments that would fade. Didn't matter so much, because what they wanted was that wow factor. You know, when it's first painted, then it fades and gets dirty, so they paint it over and do it again. You know.
Well, you've just answered the one other question that was in the chat there from Victoria about whether you get the impression that they are regularly overpainted and updated much in the way that we do in our own houses today.
Yeah, I found, I think, given that I think they were common between about 1570 and 1620, so that's sort of 50 years for the most part, give or take a bit. I did find one scheme that I analysed had 3 schemes painted in there. So it had the original scheme, then lime wash. Well, the original scheme, lots of soot, dirt and rubbish, then lime wash, another pigment, then dirt and everything, then another lime wash and another pigment. And so yeah, I think they were done fairly often.
Wow. Would you like to share your other slides before I don't want us to run out of time, because I know you've got some delicious ones in there that we haven't seen.
Yeah, this was just if people, well, to answer the question of dating, because that particularly I found very useful. So I dug out some extra slides, which I think can be dated fairly accurately. So this is at Bramhall Hall. I don't know if people know Bramhall Hall. This dates the 1530s, and it's got some quite good detail of costuming. These figures are it's in a solar, at the sort of high end of the solar. The room is decorated all over, or was, it isn't now, there's only 2 walls left, with what is definitely late medieval stuff. And I think the costume, the figures are more than life size, but, you know, beautifully painted, lots of detail. And nice detail of a hat there. So you could probably date this more accurately. I think I sent it to the V&A and they came back with about 50. Oh, and you, Jane and Nina had a go at dating it as well, didn't you? Yeah, yeah. 1530s, and that would fit in. If you remember, I showed you a picture of a man and his wife at Downes Manor, which has been demolished now. And this image is from Trevelyan's great book, which was a book of images which was put together in about 1618. These are images that were circulating throughout his lifetime, and he sort of collected these. And this was his portrait of marriage. And I think it is the stance and the dating of the costume, they look sort of quite similar to the one at Downes Manor. And I think there must have been a contemporary way of illustrating marriage. They're not wearing the same clothes. It's not a copy of that print, because I think he's probably wearing his own clothes. And I've got a few from Trevelyan. This is another scene. This is a prodigal son. So again, you can see what people's concept of what the sort of society the son might have been mixing with. And here's from the Angel Inn at Pershaw, a lady who is clearly in sort of some quite high status dress. I've included this because this helps dating. I don't know whether people have seen this, Herfnagel's print of None Such Palace, which has long since been demolished. But on the bottom row, we've got some figures that are labelled who they are. So the 3 figures on the left are merchants' wives, typical costume for merchants. The 2 on the right are noble women. Then the figure on the left here, the nobilis aulica, is princely dress. I think that's what my Latin translated it as. And then next to her is a rustic countrywoman. And then 2 fishwives on the right. So it's, you know, not dissimilar. The dress that I've shown you, you know, could sort of match up with the status that's assigned to these figures. I've included this, which is, I don't know what happened to the photo. I'll have to go and take it again. This is, I guess, 1590s, I can't remember, but useful to show the dress. But it's in the White Swan in Stratford. If anyone ever goes to Stratford, it's in the bar and anyone can see it. It's good painting of Tobit and the Angel. Now, I've included this because during this time, and particularly in the early 17th century, portrait painting rocketed. It became so popular, and the portraits generally are pretty awful, but they were there to signify status. And here we've got John Faulkner, who was 3 times mayor of the city of Gloucester, having his portrait painted with his sort of his gown. And that's, I think, probably fairly typical of the age, because again, from Trevelyan, we've got people, you know, gentry in very similar costume, fur-lined gowns. And here we've got, where you can see at the top, it says Robert Catesby. He was involved in the Gunpowder Plot and he was killed in 1605. So we've got a date for that sort of costume. I included these because I just thought they were hilarious. Here's one of Pride. She seems to have missed a bit of costume out. I don't know how common that was, but in another picture of Pride, again, bits missing to cover up. Here we've got what's the Queen of Sheba, so costume as rich as you can get, and it's the sort of thing that Elizabeth was wearing, so not vernacular costume. But these are sort of more everyday. This is a family at the table. I imagine this is what a sort of godly household, you know, everybody's well behaved and, you know, properly dressed, and not necessarily best dressed showing off, but showing everyday functions. And here we've got one that's dated, which is always useful. Dated costume. And I just liked this one. This is in the V&A. What does it say? Not so quick-sighted is the eagle for her prey, as I knew fashion spy to make me gay. So that was the end of those. Have I stopped sharing screen? No.
Yes.
Yes,
Yep.
I have. Yeah, okay.
Leslie asked a question. She asked, can you provide a little more detail about Trevelyan's book, please?
Right. Not a huge amount, actually. It wasn't published. It was a collection of these images. I don't know who painted them, whether he had them painted, but it's a collection, and it was just, I think is it in the V&A? I can't remember where it is actually, but somebody paid a fortune to have it reproduced about 20 years ago. And they've got a couple of copies in Oxford and one in the V&A. So I think there would have been images circulating at the time. I've not actually come across anybody who's done research on the dissemination of images in the early modern period. It's because I've come across paintings that are very similar, that look as though they've got a similar source, you know, in Kent and on the Welsh border, and it's clearly not done by the same hand, and they're quite complex patterns. So I sort of keep questioning, how were images disseminated? And clearly Trevelyan's picked up some in his book. You know, he's based in London. This, you know, this sort of house in Worcestershire, Dulles Manor, was just on the Shropshire-Worcestershire border. You know, it must be from the same source. It's so specific, but I don't know how he collected them or where they came from. So there's another research project for someone.
We've got a reproduction from Trevelyan's book on page 112 of the Typical Tudor, And we obtained permission to use that from the Folger Shakespeare Library in Washington. So I'm pretty sure that you can look through the whole book online if you go to the website for that.
Right.
And actually we've featured men in similar gowns to the ones that you showed. And Pat has made the comment that Gloucester City produced a calendar a few years ago, which I also have a copy of, with all these proud mayoral people, in some cases married couples, looking suitably civic and celebrated for their good works in the community. So yeah, you're right, there are conventions in the way people are being portrayed.
Yeah.
Can I just say something or ask something?
Yes.
You said they run out in the 17th century, yeah?
Yeah.
Yeah. There's one that has been refound. I won't say it's been found because it made the newspapers last week.
Oh,
And when
yes,
I looked into it, it actually been found in 1998 and then covered over again. So obviously 20 years is long enough to lose a set of wall paintings. But the images there are from Francis Quarles' Book of Emblems, which was published in 1632. So I'm going to assume that's right at the very end of the wall painting thing.
Yeah. There were paintings after them, but they changed in character completely. They're no longer the sort of flamboyant, all over the walls, all over the ceilings, the doors, covered everything. They tend, when you get some, and you do get them later, they're more architecturally conscious. So they could be a frieze or an overmantel. So they're not the riotous Elizabethan type of decoration. But that I do think is quite late for the use of emblems as well, the late 17th century. So I'd be interested in seeing that, but clearly, yeah, I don't know who's dated them that late, but there clearly is something that made people date them that late.
Well, the images themselves have been taken from Francis Quarles' Book of Emblems, and that wasn't published till 1632.
Yeah, but they've dated these to the late 17th century, haven't they?
Ah, yeah, I think because the house is actually later, isn't it? I think the house is later.
I can't remember, but they put them in sort of 1670s or something, and I think by then I'm just surprised. But yeah, you know, that's why I think it's really, really interesting to look into the dissemination of images. You know, I think there's lots of cases where it'd be useful to know how images got from A to B.
Maybe that's a useful research question on which we should break for our refreshment.